Hello. looks like looks like where I'm sitting here looks like I'm oh Facebook came back. Looks I put up like a little bit of pathetic decorations. You're welcome. Some pathetic decorations back there. And now they're like sticking out of my head. If I'm on Facebook anyway, they're like sticking out of my head. Oh, that white balance. I apologize, y'all. My laptop just doesn't like the white balance, but my phone is like, cool, white balance is cool. It's all good. And do you like my 80s hair today? I've got like, wah! Got it back. Yeah, you're welcome. Just decided to let the bangs be all like asymmetrical fluffies. I feel like this is 80s. Maybe it's not. I feel like it's 80s, maybe early 90s. Anywho, hey, good morning, good morning, good morning. Live office hours with me, Dr. Shannon Coates. Y'all say y'all in Canada? Nice, good question. I have adopted it. No, we do not. And in fact, lots of times Canadians give me a little, side eye when I use it because no, we do not. In fact, it's one of the things that we pride ourselves on not doing because we're not American, right? Canadians, we all pride ourselves on not being American. So our single most defining feature is that we're not American. Anywho, I have adopted it. I use it quite a bit personally, not only because I hang out with so many Americans, but also because I'm really working to remove some of the, slightly problematic language out of my language, slightly problematic terminology out of my language. So, and in my communication. So I am working, I often say friends, but I am working on that. So yeah, y'all comes out and y'all works so beautifully. Y'all. And it is a fun word to say. Let's be honest. It is a fun word to say. All right, so my name is Dr. Shannon Coates. I am here about 45 minutes, maybe an hour north of Toronto. Toronto, that was a very American way of saying that word, by the way. Toronto, I'm north of Toronto. And these are the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabewaki, the Mississauga, and the Wendat-Wendat peoples. And I am grateful to live and work on these lands. My pronouns are she and they. That's lots of introductions, aren't they? And, I am someone who works with resources and develops resources for voice teachers. And if you would like to check out the resources. They're all now listed, along with biography and everything, all of that stuff over on my website, which, woohoo, amazing. So my website is no longer shannon-coates.com. Although if you put that in, it'll still get you over to the new website, but it is now Dr. Shannon Coates. drshannoncoates.com. So if you have a chance, take a look over there. And if you're interested, take a look at the, I think it's called like How to Work with Me, and then the undegree is in there. And so if you are interested in what's coming up in terms of the undegree in the next little while, that would be terrific. So today, live office hours today, I wanted to get in here and talk a little bit about flow and flow phonation, which is, and because it's Monday, talk a little bit about some specific ways to encourage flow phonation in whichever direction we're looking at, or whichever direction we would like. So I wanted to just kind of talk about it because Mondays, I like to talk a little bit more like concrete and what are some specific things, around technique and coordination and singing and all that stuff. And then on Fridays, I do like to talk a little bit more about theoretical things around teaching and pedagogy. So I decided to talk about flow and flow phonation and the concept of flow and flow phonation because in almost every single practicum that I do, let me back up just a little bit. I have been going through my online course, the Vocal Instrument 101, which I created 3 years ago. And so it's having a 3-year anniversary sale, and I'm starting December 1st, with workbooks and all that kind of thing. So that's coming out soon, but I've been going through that, and it's like it is a 101. There's lots in there. I was so tempted to just like redo the entire thing, but I'm not going to right now because it's not a 101. Anyway, so there's lots in there that is really foundational information, and then things that I feel now are even more foundational, or sort of, are things that I wish I had included. And so things like, for example, this concept of flow and flow phonation, which every single practicum that I do, every time I work with a group of voice teachers, it seems like I get a question about, or there needs to be more clarity around this idea of flow and flow phonation. And and the last practicum that I did was no exception. And so I thought this might be a good one just to drop a little bit of a primer, like a little bit of a 101, because it isn't really in my vocal instrument 101 either. Like, I don't feel like I explain it as well as I would like to in the vocal instrument 101, but I have to give myself grace because it was 3 years ago, and it's fine. It's fine. So that's why I wanted to talk about that one today. Flow phonation. So flow phonation is a concept that in a way of describing a particular way of the vocal instrument working. And we do have some specific measurements that we can take, and we can look on spectrograph and blah, blah, blah. There are some specific things that we can do, but we mostly are judging flow phonation, especially as voice teachers. We're judging, and I don't mean that negatively, I mean we're assessing flow phonation by our ears. So we're figuring out whether the tonal outcome or what's happening in the coordination of that singer is a flow phonation or not by what's happening in our ear. So initially, I think, don't quote me on this. Initially, I think the concept of flow phonation was initially used explicitly with our SLP colleagues. So in therapy, with our speech language pathology colleagues in therapy, and specifically in voice therapy, not necessarily related to singing, although lots of our SLP colleagues work with singers, but related to singing, but really related to speech and phonation. And so this was the idea or the concept of flow phonation and working with flow came into the therapeutic realm. So it's sort of like a therapy, the idea around and the exercises that they used and that we now often use in singing voice explicitly was part of a therapeutic practice before we started to really use the terminology and start to kind of be explicit about it in our singing practices. And I believe that this was coined initially, or recognized, maybe is a better way to put it, or made explicit by Sundberg originally. Someone can correct me on that if that's incorrect, but I'm fairly certain it was Johann Sundberg who initially came up with the concept. And so that was part of the reason, or observed this concept. And so that was also, I think, part of the reason that it started to filter into the singing voice, is that Johann Sundberg works so specifically with voice and with singing voice, so or works so beautifully, let's say, with the singing voice. So what is it? What is this thing? What is this flow phonation? So flow phonation, I just wrote down a couple of things to make sure that I say all the things I want to say, so I'm just going to check that. Yes, flow phonation is the most economical airflow to glottal resistance combination or coordination that we can find. Whenever we hear a tonal outcome that has release, that feels buoyant, that feels like it is easy, that feels like it has flow in it, all of those things, our ear, we are likely going to call that a flow phonation. We're going to likely associate that, the coordination that is happening to create that tonal outcome, with flow phonation, meaning we're hearing the outcome of a really balanced airflow to pressurization equation. So airflow meaning with how much force, possibly energy, but let's say force for now, or how much pressure the air is moving through the vocal folds, and then how much pressure do the vocal folds then have to use in order to resist that airflow? Oops, sorry friends, there we go. So how much pressure do the vocal folds then have to use in order to resist that airflow? So if we have a strongly pressurized airflow, and I always use my fist for that, but hopefully that doesn't create the wrong image. But if we have a strongly pressurized airflow, the vocal folds then, in order to resist that strong level of pressurization, the vocal folds have to meet with a lot of closure. So a lot of closure in order to be able to resist that airflow, not just be blown apart. So the stronger the pressurization of the breath, the less flow we have at the vocal fold level. And then the tonal outcome is likely going to go toward a pressed tonal outcome. And in this case, pressed does not necessarily mean negative, okay? So if you've got your Western classical ears on, pressed does not necessarily mean negative. Pressed just means that we've got lots of resistance at the vocal fold level because of how pressurized the air is. And then on the other side of that spectrum, so if we're talking about, it's useful to put this on a flow spectrum. So we've got our flow, and then and we've got a sort of high pressure, low flow is going to give us our pressed sound, or toward the pressed side of the spectrum. And then low pressure, high flow. So if I've got this floaty, low pressure air moving through my vocal folds, and my folds are like, woo, so happy, lots of flow happening at the vocal folds. Not that they're so happy, that they just don't have to resist, right? They don't have to have that same level of resistance. Then we're going to be going toward a breathier flow state. So the less pressure I have moving through the vocal folds, the less the folds have to meet. So the less real estate I have to employ in my folds to meet in order to resist that air pressure, because low pressure, lots of flow. So if I've got low pressure, I might only have 10% of the folds meeting every time they oscillate. See how I've got 10% of the real estate coming together at once every time? And then on the other side, if I've got high pressure, I'm going to have like 90%. See how it's like 90%? Almost the entire fold is closed every time it oscillates, right? So the folds are together, but every time it oscillates, because it has to resist the pressure of that air as it moves through the folds. So what this does for our tonal outcome is we get a breathier tone, as we move from 10% of the folds meeting. And by the way, this doesn't really have to do with thick folds and thin folds, because we can have a pressurized or a breathy sound. If I have thin folds, see, I only got 10% of my folds meeting there, or I got like 90% of my folds meeting there. So we can have I can have a pressed head voice sound, if you will. I mean, it's not as likely to happen, but it can happen. And I can have a breathy chest voice sound. Again, not as likely to happen, but it can happen. I can have right? That's chest voice. Those are full folds moving together, but maybe I only had like 10% of the folds coming together. So that was a breathy chest voice. That's not really about, it does have to do with thick and thin folds. There is a relationship there, yes, for sure. Nothing works in a vacuum, or nothing works on its own in this instrument. You can't just pull one part out. So there's definitely a relationship, but it isn't necessarily that we're talking about thick and thin folds here. We're talking about how much real estate is required to resist the pressurization of the airflow. And the lower the pressurization, the higher the flow, the less real estate is required, so the higher the flow. The higher the pressurization, the lower the flow, the more real estate is required to resist that high pressure airflow. So we get then our tonal outcome, we can put it on this spectrum of breathy to pressed, and flow phonation is somewhere in the middle there, and there's a range of what may be considered flow phonation to our ears depending on what kind of tonal outcome we're looking for. So if I'm looking for a belt, it is definitely a belt sound. It is definitely going to go farther toward a belt sound, especially in in the upper range, so, and in an estrogen dominant vocal tract. So that is definitely going to trend toward the pressed side of the scale. Is it going to get all the way over and tip over pressed to yelling? Hopefully not, right? We don't generally want a yell sound. Yell is too pressed. So we don't generally want to go all the way over to a yell sound, but we're definitely going to go over to that pressed side of things and get farther away from the breathy side of things if I'm belting. Why? Because I've got thick folds and I need to, I've got lots of real estate, resist the pressurization, and then I need it also how that works with sound, blah. Whatever, we're not talking about that today. And then if I'm working in a head voice sound, especially in an more estrogen dominant vocal tract, I am definitely going to be cheating more toward that flow phonation, and I'm likely, if I'm working in Western classical sounds, especially as a soprano or a mezzo-soprano, I'm likely going to be cheating a little bit toward that breathy side. If I'm working in Western classical sounds as a tenor or baritone, I might be cheating a little bit over the line toward a little bit more pressurization, depending on where, because those thicker folds, I got a little bit more to play with. All of that. So that's a little primer of flow phonation and of this kind of scale and where, or the spectrum, if you will, and where and how this all kind of works out. And then I wanted to just offer two exercises or two ideas around working to create more pressed phonation, or to get away from the breathy side of things, and or to create less pressurization, or pressed sound, and to get toward the breathy side. So say you're working with someone who does not have enough vocal fold closure. So the flow is too breathy. In other words, the folds are not closing well enough. The air is not giving enough pressurization, so we're not getting enough closure. So we're getting a sound that is, perhaps we're getting a belt sound that's really weak, or sounds too heady, or sounds like it's too flowy. Perhaps we're getting a belt sound that's something like that. Perhaps we're working with a Western classical singer whose middle voice, so a soprano or a mezzo, whose middle voice, an estrogen dominant instrument, whose middle voice has a hole in it. So because it's too heady. Perhaps we're working with someone who has a lot of breathiness in the sound just overall. Perhaps we're working with someone whose sound is a little bit out of the body, if you will, right? It's not like sometimes when we have the urge to say that someone needs to have better support, often what we're hearing is that sound is a little bit too far toward the breathy side of things, or we're getting a little bit too not enough real estate, not enough pressurization. So what are some of the things an exercise for that, a beautiful exercise for that, is to incorporate some glottals, some actual glottal exercises, some staccato glottal exercises. Do we want Not necessarily, but do we want from speech level, yes. What am I doing with that? I'm closing my vocal folds and I'm holding the air back just a little bit. So I'm building up pressure from the airflow. I'm allowing that airflow to kind of build up under the folds, and then I'm allowing the airflow to kind of burst through with some pressurization, or with some pressed, so I'm getting a little bit more pressed. So what happens there is I teach my folds what it feels like. I teach my body what it feels like to create a slightly more pressed sound for a better closure, better glottal closure. And then I can work that into, say I've got a singer whose upper belt goes too heady. So if I've got right? I might want to start them with a little bit better glottal start, better closure on that bottom pitch. So I stay in that pressed phonation. And again, pressed does not necessarily mean negative in this case, right? I'm not talking about yelling. I'm talking about on this spectrum, I'm going to stay over on that slightly more pressed side in order to have the phonation that's required, that higher pressurization that's required to create that more intense tonal outcome. Same thing if I'm working with someone in the middle voice. Maybe I start, rather than asking for, maybe I start middle voice and I ask them for like a glottal start into the vowel that they're singing, for example, or something along those lines. All I'm saying is, if you're hearing that there isn't enough pressurization, the sound isn't in the body, that it's not a full enough sound, that the belt is weak, blah, blah, blah. See what you can do from the mechanics of pressed phonation. So again, for those of you tuning in, pressed not meaning negative. We're not talking about yelling. We're talking about better vocal fold closure. On the other side of that scale, if you've got an overpressed sound where we actually need to add a little bit more flow, we need to get those folds to, we need that air stream to be less pressed, and we need the folds to be pressurized, and we need the folds to actually meet with a little less real estate, so maybe only 50% real estate rather than 90% real estate, because the tonal outcome is a little too intense, maybe it's a little too strident, maybe it's a little yelly, maybe it's a little too open, let's say. If we're looking for all, if we're working on all of on creating a tonal outcome that's a little bit more flowy, if we start to think back to our scale, we think back to our spectrum of flow to pressed sound, what's something that's going to get us a little bit closer to the flow side, to the breathy side? Well, we can start with some breathy onsets, certainly. That doesn't all play with breathy onsets. What is actually often far more useful is actually playing with head voice sensation. So we associate head voice with our breathy side of that flow, with more flow, and there's good reason for that. In our head voice sensation, we have those, if we are in true head voice, meaning if we're in mode 2, if we're in mode 2 where the folds are thin, then we definitely will not have the same ability to resist high pressure sound, because there just isn't enough real estate there, right? We just don't have enough real estate to recruit in order to resist a high pressure sound. A high pressure airwave, that high pressure airwave is going to blow the folds apart. I don't have enough real estate to recruit. So by adding a sensation of head voice, and this is something that some of you may find familiar, this is part of the reason when you're hearing someone who has an overly pressed belt or an overly intense belt, when you say, what happens if we add a little bit of head voice to that? Or if you work from head voice, so you work on the straws, some of the exercises that I've done before, or you work on maybe a slightly quieter sound or adding head voice, this is part of the reason that can be a very useful technique to release some of that pressurization, because we associate that sensation of head voice, which is may or may not actually be thinner folds, but we associate it, or may or may not actually be like head voice, true head voice at the glottis, right? Glottis position. We associate that with more flow. Why do we associate it with more flow? Because generally when the folds are thinner, we do have more flow. So you can take that sensation of head voice, which is more flow, and throw it into the mix with folks who are using more pressurization than they need to, and having this resultant tonal outcome that is perhaps a little bit too strident, a little too pressed, a little too robust, maybe. let's choose a nice description. It's a little too robust, that tonal outcome. So what we come up with then is, or the way we work then, is we come up with exercises that start us in head voice. I mean, there are lots of exercises, for example, if you're working with testosterone-influenced voices in the upper register and working to release some of the pressurization. Now that has a lot to do with shaping too, so keep that in your back pocket. But there's lots to do with coming from, yes, robust, strident, pressed, coming from the upper register. So you do like in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ah. So as I move between that head voice and chest voice, I'm taking the sensation of the flow that I had in the head voice, and I'm putting big quotes around all this stuff, but that I had in the head voice, and I'm expecting to feel it in when I move into chest voice, or that higher pressurized sound. I'm expecting to still feel that, so that I don't go into yell. So rather than 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ah, right, I go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, I feel that flow, I increase that pressurization, I increase the intensity of my breath flow, as well as then I get that resistance, but I still keep the same flow sensation that I had when I was working with the thinner fold configuration. So that's just something to kind of consider in the studio this week. You know, often we work from vowel shaping, or we work from vocal tract shaping, or we work from changing a breath, the actual breath, which the way we inhale. I'll tell you this, often when I'm working with classically trained singers, Western classically trained singers, and we're working on a belt sound, or we're working on something that is a high pressurized sound, often the inhalation is the thing that is tripping them up. Because the inhalation sets them up. I'm a well-trained singer in Western classical singing, so my inhalation sets me up for, not only does it set me up for vocal tract shaping, it sets me up for a kind of release of breath flow that is this very flowy breath flow, right? This is the way that classical singing works. So I'm like in an estrogen dominant voice, right? So I'm going to be like, oh, even if I have that chest voice sound, and even if I do ha, sometimes that flow triggers, if you've been well trained in Western classical singing, sometimes that flow and just that inhalation triggers the flow and the vocal folds. So it triggers the folds to have this kind of high flow with low pressurization, because that's generally what we're doing in our Western classical singing. It triggers that in singers. So sometimes going from the actual inhalation, where I'm like, I'll say like, don't breathe, you're not allowed to breathe. So you have to go like, you have to say something first, hi, my name is Shannon, and then I'm singing, ah, so I don't take this like, hi, my name is Shannon, right? See how that, oh, sorry about that. See how that like inhalation triggered or set up for me my flow phonation toward that breathier side. So sometimes we work from the actual inhalation, but let me just encourage you this week, when you're hearing something that is a little less flowy than you would like, see if you can think through, okay, how can I change this flow dynamic? How can I get the vocal folds to have a little less resistance? And how can I have that breath to have a little less pressure? Or conversely, if you're working with someone and you need a little bit more pressed sound, wait, did I say that the wrong way? Conversely, you need a little more pressed, no? Oh, you need a little more flow. On the other side, if you do need a little bit more flow, things are a little bit too robust, a little bit too pressed, a little bit too intense, maybe even yelly. If you're on that side of things, how can I encourage a little bit more flow? So how can I get the folds to go a little bit, wait, am I saying it the right way? To go a little bit farther this way, and how can I encourage the breath to be a little bit more flowy and a little less pressed? Sorry if that last bit, if I mixed them up. I think I didn't, but maybe I did. And maybe I just said the same thing twice, and you're welcome for that. My whole thing is just, if you're hearing something in the flow, so if something's a little too breathy, or something's a little too pressed, you're following? Awesome, thank you. If you're on one side or the other, come back to the mechanics of airflow and resistance to airflow. Just come back to those mechanics and see if you can find your way through exercises that will change those dynamics. Again, there's, shaping, vowel shapes, where we are in the pitch range. There's lots and lots of different things involved in all of this, but, consider that. Consider that. Have a terrific week. Like I said, if you get a chance, take a look at my website. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Also have a pop-up coming up, a pop-up voice ped class, the last one in 2021, the final 2021 voice ped class, pop-up voice ped class is December 8th, like 10 days from now. And it's on the adolescent and expanding voice. So if you are a voice teacher, an independent voice teacher, you're probably going to want to tune in because you probably 100% work with adolescent and expanding voices, right? That was a really creaky little sound there that I used. Sorry. Okay. Have a great day. Boop. Let's end that. And ending here.